If you enjoy a good Donald Trump humiliation story, then please stand by, because I have not one, but two stories that will satisfy your Trump takedown soul coming up next. In our featured story, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee just hit him right in the ego with a Nazi comparison to what just transpired with the medal transfer. But first, he also suffered a new domestic blow with regards to his Kennedy Center takeover. The New York Times article reads,
Martha Graham Dance Company won't celebrate centennial at Kennedy Center. The Martha Graham Dance Company said on Friday that it would not perform at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts this spring as part of the troupe's centennial tour across the United States. The Martha Graham Dance Company regrets that we are unable to perform at the Kennedy Center in April, it said in a statement. We hope to perform at the center in the future. The company did not give a reason for the withdrawal, but several artists and groups have pulled out of Kennedy Center events since its Board of Trustees voted last month to add President Trump's name to the building. The Kennedy Center regularly hosts major touring companies like American Ballet Theater and New York City Ballet, and it has a history of staging modern and contemporary troupes. In August, it named Stephen Nakagawa, a former dancer with the Washington Ballet, as its director of dance and programming after dismissing the previous leadership. Some of the fired employees said that Richard Grinnell, the center's president, had told them to come up with programming he considered more broadly appealing, citing the TV show So You Think You Can Dance as an example. In a letter to Grinnell that Nakagawa wrote before his hiring, he said he was distressed by the rise of woke culture at the Washington Ballet and other companies. He wrote that he wanted to end the dominance of leftist ideologies in the arts and return to classical ballet's purity and timeless beauty. Martha Graham Dance Company is the latest group or artist to withdraw from Kennedy Center events. Bela Fleck, an 18-time Grammy Award winner, pulled out from performances with the National Symphony Orchestra, and jazz musicians canceled Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve concerts at the center. The Washington National Opera, which had performed at the center since 1971, announced last week that it would permanently move out. Those are just the highlights. For the full story, please visit the New York Times website.
Two things about that article. Bringing something like So You Think You Can Dance to the cultural hub of performance art reflects on Trump's uncultured reality TV paradigm. And second, did you notice that the Times made 5 references to the Kennedy Center and made 0 references to the Trump Kennedy Center? 0. And now for something less than 0 for that 0. Another historical dot has been connected between Trump and Nazi Germany. A post by Monica Henson sums it up perfectly. 2 people in history have gotten secondhand Nobel Peace Prizes that didn't win. The first was Joseph Goebbels in 1943. And the Peace Prize Committee issued this scathing press release to leave no doubt where they stand on Maria Corina Machado gifting her medal to Trump.
The Nobel Prize and the laureate are inseparable. The medal and the diploma are the physical symbols confirming that an individual or organization has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The prize itself, the honor and recognition, remains inseparably linked to the person or organization designated as the laureate by the Norwegian Nobel Committee. A laureate cannot share the prize with
in charge, now senior editor at Lawfare and MS Now national security and intelligence analyst. Welcome to both of you guys. So, Jeff, what are you hearing about this new Washington Post report that 1,500 active duty troops are being prepared for possible deployment to Minnesota? And how serious is the president about invoking the Insurrection Act?
Well, one thing I've certainly learned as a reporter who covers President Trump, and I think this country has learned from his second term in particular, but also his first 4 years in office, is you have to take President Trump seriously when he says something. So I think that's the answer to your question, Alex. People should take it seriously because when he says things like that, he means it. That said, he has backed away from it a little bit since the initial threat and said more recently that he doesn't need to do it now, but he will do it if he'll basically keep that tool in his toolbox. And as far as troops being prepared, I mean, I think that the confirmation that White House officials apparently have given, saying that the Pentagon is always ready, is a sign that they're always ready. And they also know, the people who work for the president in the Pentagon, certainly starting with the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, he knows that they have to be ready when an order like that could come. So just to go back to what I said initially, it's not just journalists and citizens who need to take it seriously when the president says something like that. It's his people and his staff and his inner circle as well.
So, Michael, the Post reports officials characterizing the Pentagon's prepare to deploy orders as, quote, prudent planning. So even if it turns out to be just a planning step, does this represent a major escalation by the administration? Under what circumstances would a federal government plan to deploy active duty soldiers against American protesters be considered legal?
Under the Insurrection Act, that is the only mechanism by which I can see the president doing this lawfully. But as we know from his first term and the first year of this term, the requirement that something be done lawfully may not be the handbrake that it has been for other administrations. What we are seeing is an unprecedented escalation in American history of the use of military forces potentially to subdue a civilian population which is not accused of doing anything wrong whatsoever and is simply exercising their First Amendment rights. This is a Rubicon that once we cross could very well have deleterious consequences.
So, but Michael, so yes, the president could invoke the Insurrection Act, but is there a bar at which the president must meet or exceed before doing so legally?
The Insurrection Act itself is not very specific. Like many of our provisions of the Constitution or laws dating from the early years of this country, it's written in generalities. There was always an assumption that there were going to be certain norms and virtues among our leadership that would not make spelling out every single situation necessary. So under the Act, he probably has more latitude than most people are comfortable with. And under recent Supreme Court precedents, there's not a lot of consequences if he oversteps. So if I was part of Minnesota's state leadership or Minneapolis's city government, I'd be considerably concerned about this step.
Well, in fact, this
instruments of influence and leverage in broader decision-making environments. This discussion is not about any specific leader, country, or event. Instead, it examines general patterns in how economic measures are sometimes applied beyond traditional commercial objectives. Economic tools are often introduced with the goal of shaping markets, encouraging domestic growth, or protecting specific industries. However, history shows that these tools can also take on additional roles, influencing behavior, signaling intent, and reshaping relationships between different systems. In some cases, economic measures begin to replace more traditional forms of engagement. Rather than relying solely on dialogue, negotiation, or formal agreements, decision-makers may choose economic pressure as a faster or more visible method of influence. This shift reflects a belief that financial incentives and constraints can prompt action more directly than extended discussions. This approach changes how influence is exercised. Instead of quiet negotiation behind closed doors, economic measures operate in the open. They affect markets, businesses, and consumers immediately, making their impact more visible and measurable. Supporters of this approach often argue that economic tools are efficient. They can be implemented quickly, adjusted as needed, and scaled up or down depending on response. Because they operate through existing commercial systems, they do not require new institutions or lengthy processes. At the same time, the use of economic pressure introduces complexity. Economic systems are interconnected. Measures intended to influence one group often affect others indirectly. Supply chains, pricing structures, and investment decisions can all shift in response. This interconnectedness means that economic tools rarely act in isolation. When applied, they can create ripple effects across multiple sectors, regions, or industries. Some of these effects are anticipated, while others emerge over time. Another important aspect is symbolism. Economic measures often serve as signals. They communicate dissatisfaction, urgency, or resolve. Even when their direct financial impact is limited, their symbolic value can be significant. Symbolic actions influence perception. They shape how decisions are interpreted by observers, partners, and markets. Perception, in turn, influences behavior, sometimes more strongly than the economic effect itself. In some situations, economic tools are framed as alternatives to escalation. By applying financial pressure, decision makers may aim to avoid more disruptive or irreversible actions. From this perspective, economic measures are seen as a middle ground between inaction and more extreme responses. This framing emphasizes control. Economic tools can be adjusted incrementally. They can be paused, intensified, or redirected. This flexibility allows for experimentation and response to feedback. However, flexibility also introduces uncertainty. When economic measures are used frequently or unpredictably, planning becomes more difficult. Businesses and organizations may hesitate to invest or expand when conditions feel unstable. Predictability matters. Stable systems rely on clear expectations. When economic tools are applied inconsistently, confidence can erode. This erosion may reduce cooperation and slow growth. Another consideration is scope. Economic measures can be targeted narrowly or applied broadly. Narrow measures aim to influence specific behaviors, while broad measures affect entire sectors or markets. Broad measures tend to have wider consequences. They may reach unintended participants who are not directly involved in the original objective. This can raise questions about proportionality and fairness. Over time, reliance on economic pressure can reshape norms. What begins as an exceptional measure may become routine. As this happens, the threshold for using economic tools may lower, making them a default response rather than a last resort. This normalization changes expectations. Participants may begin to anticipate economic pressure as part of regular interaction. This anticipation influences strategy, planning, and communication. Another important dimension is domestic impact. Economic measures affect not only external participants, but also internal systems. Prices, employment, and investment can shift as a result. These internal effects must be managed carefully. Balancing external influence with internal stability is challenging. Decision makers must weigh intended outcomes against potential costs. This balance requires constant monitoring and adjustment. Oversight and review play a role here. In many systems, the use of economic authority is subject to evaluation. Questions may arise about whether measures align with established rules, frameworks, or mandates. Review processes help clarify boundaries. They define what is permissible, what requires justification, and what may need revision. This oversight supports accountability and consistency. Another key concept is effectiveness. The success of economic tools depends on how they are received and interpreted. Compliance is not guaranteed. In some cases, pressure leads to adaptation rather than compliance. Adaptation can take many forms. Participants may seek alternative markets, restructure operations, or develop workarounds. These adaptations can reduce the effectiveness of the original measure over time. This dynamic creates a cycle. As participants adapt, measures may need to change. This cycle requires ongoing attention and resources. Communication influences this process. Clear explanation of objectives, conditions, and expectations can improve effectiveness. When goals are understood, responses are more likely to align. Ambiguity can undermine outcomes. When objectives are unclear, participants may misinterpret intent or prepare for worst-case scenarios. This can increase resistance rather than cooperation. Another important factor is credibility. Economic tools are more effective when backed by consistent action and clear follow-through. When measures are announced but not enforced, credibility weakens. Credibility builds over time. Consistent application reinforces expectations. Inconsistent use introduces doubt. However, consistency must be balanced with restraint. Overuse can reduce impact. If economic pressure becomes routine, its signaling power diminishes. This is why some observers emphasize selectivity. Using economic tools sparingly preserves their influence. It signals seriousness